So this time, welcome, not from Lutz Vollmer because he's ill in bed, as already said, but this time with only me as Stefan Walzer and obviously with my special guest, Renato Dellamano from Italy.
Nice to meet you all.
Perfect. Thank you all for connecting. I think today with a very special topic. I think it's really on pricing strategy. And I think the core part of it is not only discussing, let's say, how pricing strategies may be also being set up, but it's also the question, I think, Renato, we discussed already a couple of times, whether it's more an art or a science or probably both of the two parts, right?
Yeah.
So let's just see. I mean, just a couple of pieces before we start with the webinar. I think you know ourselves. I think if you listen to us already since a month or maybe years, I think we are the German-speaking market access agency for Austria, Germany, Switzerland. So for the DACH countries, we support you in terms of pricing and reimbursement strategy, health economics, the whole submissions in those countries with the different kind of, let's say, pathways, and also with respect to the negotiation support. I think the negotiation support may be also interesting for whoever is listening in and maybe sees that newly. I mean, we have also developed in the last months and probably a bit more than already than a year, our virtual reality boot camps, where we have also developed specifically, let's say, the kind of rooms by the GBA, by the GKV, SV, and also by the BfArM, that you can also have a real coaching in a kind of real-time environment within those kind of frames. I think also, Renato, our joint episode of the podcast went out this month as well. It was already a quite good success. So whoever wants to hear more on the topic, it was exactly the same topic, art and science, but I think we have probably had another kind of, let's say, direction in the episode. So listen in, available on all available, or let's say popular podcast players, or also on our website. I think the latest one was also on the private health insurances as a kind of core entrance into Germany. And the next one will be on Austria. Listen in. I think it's one of the really good episodes as well. It will come out March 1st, so next week. Even though that Lutz is not in our webinar today, feel free, obviously, to ask your questions. I mean, you have the two different functions. You can either use the Zoom chat function or also the Q&A function. No worries. Renato and myself will be able to manage that also at the end of the session. So whenever you have a question, just type it in, that we can take it up as well when we are at the end of the presentation. Also keep in mind that if you have missed a webinar, or if you want maybe to watch as well another webinar what we had in the last couple of months and years, just go on our website, www.marketaccess-pricingstrategy.de, or also obviously subscribe to our YouTube channel. But I think today, and it was just last minute, Lutz, we tried it hard to come. So we have our presenters and discussants today. I think Renato Dellamano, already a long-standing health economist with a lot of experience in terms of pricing, especially also in the industry, but also since a lot of and many years now in the consultancy, also from various perspectives, and also I think within different kind of consultancies. Renato, I think you might also want to cover that a bit later. So a big hello this evening to Milan, Renato.
Thank you, Stefan.
Perfect. So myself, I'm a health economist working already in the area since many years, and I say hello from Weiler am Rhein, which is in the southwest of Germany, close to Basel. But let's just now jump into the content. So I will first start with, let's say, some aspects, and I would like then to hand over the further, let's say, discussions of art and science into Renato's direction after I have presented my slides. So starting quite broadly, and I think that's also still an important point to also, and again, remind everybody, the whole kind of revenue, which is obviously, I would at least say or at least a core indicator of success for a product, is revenue. And revenue obviously consists of two components, right? It's a price and the volume. So you would need to fix basically, or let's say you would need to work on both sides properly. And we will discuss today, especially on the pricing, but I might have one or the other comment as well on the volume. I think maybe another important consideration, and it's probably more also around my time when I was working on a global level, and obviously interested later on as well what Renato thinks about that. But if, let's say, putting a global strategy together, quite clearly the US is one of the core drivers, just because of such of a huge population as one common market in a way, even though that obviously we have different payers as well in there. And if we are then moving over to Europe, I think for most of the products, you might already cover, let's say, around 70% of the total European sales just with the EU5. And I counted in here the UK still as EU, more meaning the European 5, right? Not the European Union 5. But that's also obviously an important consideration, not meaning that the other countries would not be important, right? But it's more to also understand maybe a bit the dynamics when you put maybe a strategy together. I think also important, I personally like to speak rather about price optimization instead of price maximization. I'm an economist from background, right? So what we have been taught at the university was really that it's basically around maximization, where I think it's probably more a bit of theory, to be honest, because I mean, at the end of the day, you have still a lot of trade-offs potentially to make also, and especially within countries, but also when you think about maybe a global strategy. What do I mean by that, right? I mean, if we just think maybe about the different, let's say, markets and systems just across Europe, I mean, we might already have one or the other conflicting goal, let's say, when, let's say, just having a look on those 4, let's say, overarching further items. So it's one is obviously access to reimbursement. That's quite clear, full or maximum reimbursement. I think that's a clear goal, but the optimal price might sometimes be that kind of tricky part where I was already saying that the revenue bit is consisting of the 2 components of the equation, right? One is the price and one is the volume. And I think we all know the kind of quite famous price volume agreements in France, for example, but we also have, for example, also in Germany, you need to sign a contract at the end of the day, and at the end of the price negotiations, where also volumes are included. So also there, you sometimes have then this kind of, let's say, issue. And I think we all know, I mean, when it comes to payers and whenever, let's say, you add, for example, another indication, the first comment is for sure, I mean, you're increasing the volume, so I need to have another discount. So it shows already a bit that kind of trade-off to also think about. Other, let's say, trade-offs potentially to make is also delays. Obviously, the more time you potentially need to discuss and to negotiate maybe the price, because you might need a bit more time in order to really get, for example, the payer side in the direction you potentially want to have it, not always doable anyway. I think would anyway just let's say create one or the other delay, for example. And finally, it's also the question whether the price might come without excessive restrictions, right? Whether that's maybe step therapy, so stepwise therapy or second opinion or anything like that. I think that's maybe as well something keeping in mind. But let's just start as well with, let's say, the perspectives of the price. I think it's quite easy. It's quite clear. At the end of the day, you have 2 perspectives where a price is basically being built up. I think one is very simple, call it the market perspective, or you could also say the payer's perspective, right? Which is ultimately in our healthcare setting, the market. And then secondly, the company's perspective. I think both have obviously different, let's say, directions and different, let's say, opinions quite clearly. I think one is, let's say, the company's perspective is for sure coming, let's say, also from a gross margin or return on investment side, but also obviously, let's say, the value argument, right? How much is it really worth in terms of the benefit, the medical benefit a company or a product is better maybe offering to the patient, right? How much is a 1 additional year maybe worth, or if we even speak about healing a disease, right? On the other side, we obviously have, let's say, the kind of question, what is the perceived value then? We're coming back as well to that in a second again. And obviously, even more important, I would say, and especially when we're getting into negotiations, what are the, let's say, prices or the costs of the alternatives? And that's basically where, let's say, the 2 parts let's say, are coming against each other, so in contrast, and obviously something between might then be the kind of price range or the negotiation points in order to reach then finally. Obviously, and I think that's maybe also the question for later on when we're coming again to the strategy part, the market perspective is generally the starting point for developing the pricing strategy. So potential price anchors, besides obviously saying, I mean, what is the current kind of, let's say, cost of the patient? I mean, there are a lot of those, right? I mean, we just put a couple of those now in there, probably not all obviously fitting to all environments. And for sure, we have probably missed one or the other, for sure. I mean, we have a number of patients, quite clear. If you have an orphan drug with, for example, 10 or 100 or 150 patients, for example, across a country or maybe even across Europe, it's obviously different than if you have 10,000 or 100,000 of patients. That's obviously one of the core drivers. Think about the diabetes discussions. I mean, we had in Germany versus some of the other parts, but also, for example, in rheumatoid arthritis, I think was also some discussion in that direction. Health economics, not applicable in all countries, but for sure, it's getting, let's say, even harder in some countries. Let's call it maybe the cost effectiveness countries. We all know UK for sure, but we see that also in other countries coming further. And we also had, let's say, some components even of that bit. And if you have listened maybe to our webinar with Professor Walzer on the arbitration board, you have also heard that in some circumstances, let's say, that might also kick in the German environment. Otherwise, quite clear follow-up costs, absenteeism, physician visits, complication costs, other drug therapies, etc., could all potentially be taken as price anchors. But let's say, go a bit more, let's say, strategically or maybe systematically in there, right? So there are three core analytic, let's say, components in order to put a strategy on pricing and reimbursement together. One is the, let's call it purchase decision part, which is here on the right-hand side. So this is really understanding the buying system, right? So I mean, who is buying it, in which ways, are there any hurdles, are there any processes, etc. And obviously quite clearly, which then linked again, that's why everything is basically together, which is moved over to the value-based pricing, which is quite clearly also the kind of, let's call it the relationship between the offer and perceived value, which might obviously be a lot of times being a part. Think about progression-free survival in oncology, right? I mean, if you have a significant, clinically meaningful also benefit in progression-free survival, some payers would not accept that, even though that obviously from an industry side, it makes maybe a lot of sense. And also from a patient's perspective. And finally, we have as well the global optimization, which is also the trade-offs within and across products and markets. So sometimes between markets, it's quite clear, right? You need to keep in mind how to best, let's say, set up your price, the kind of frame of the pricing, let's call it. But also sometimes you have that kind of issue, for example, if a product would, let's say, have a second or third indication, for example, only with half the dosing, then you might already as well have a kind of global optimization issue, because from a payer's perspective, for example, one indication might be double the price from a dosing perspective than the other one. It's at least something keeping as well in mind. So if we further, let's say, put that a bit further down, where maybe we can say it's a bit more science than art potentially, but again, looking already forward to Renato, I think we could really, let's say, pull it down into different, let's say, pieces. The earlier you start, obviously, the more you're getting into a product profile, that's for sure, that's quite clear. I mean, the more you have already your clinical trials in your hands, then it's no more a real, let's say, product profile, let's say, on a theoretical basis, but you can already really, let's say, pull the actual numbers in there. And finally, also the positioning options, right? I mean, positioning could as well be something like line of therapy, maybe target patients, etc. So we are already, let's say, discussing more around the value-based pricing in that bit. Then you have the reference analysis. Where could we tackle that on, right? A lot of times, especially with startups, for example, also from the digital health area, we just ask us, well, how should we really start with really a pricing strategy? I mean, how to put a price up there instead of just taking the finger out there, right? I mean, it's a lot of times where I would as well just say, what is the real reference analysis, right? What is the real reference for you? And I think here it's really also then the question, how to really, let's say, define that, right? I mean, for example, sometimes also just if you don't have a real comparator in there or a real therapy option currently, that you might just potentially say, look, I mean, I start maybe with an indication with a similar number of patients, for example, right? Or with a similar kind of market after, or let's say, sorry, before a new therapy basically went into that. So that's already, as let's say, a quite difficult component. Then after you have, let's say, set your reference part, then it's obviously then the question on the differential. So what do you add on top of what is currently already available? And that's based on your value-based target. And for sure, the core question, that's always the discussion, for example, also at the arbitration board in Germany, how much is really that additional added benefit worth in terms of money? So what is the monetarization of that added benefit? So after that, you see then where the purchase decision part is kicking in. So you would as well need to understand basically how you could, let's say, bring the product, for example, to the market. A lot of times, not just the national basis, right? It goes down to the regional and to the local basis. And I think, Renato, you're coming from Italy. I think this is sometimes really a hard and big pain when it comes to the local part, at least when I had a look from outside. But that's really important to understand in order really to, let's say, plan your strategy accordingly. And finally, obviously, after you have that, it's also assessing then those different barriers and how to best overcome that, right? Is it further kind of discussion? Is it more alerting as well, payers? I mean, we had, or let's say the kind of stories around trastuzumab, Herceptin in breast cancer was, I think, quite impactful in my early days, at least, when I think UK said Herceptin was cost effective, but the trusts in the UK were, let's say, quite let's say, defensive against it because it was not planned into the budget the year before. So that is also where I think you see already a barrier could be overcome, but it's also needed to be, let's say, included already in the planning process beforehand. Obviously, if you see somewhere a kind of issue or a revision need, then you're going back there. And finally, you have the global optimization, identification of the market impacts, the price targets, the policy, etc. I think that's all what is needed for sure. Not only about international reference pricing, that's obviously as well kicking in parallel import might as well, for example, play a role. But having a look on that, I would say it's more science, even though that I think a lot of times it's also a lot of art, right? Especially when we're thinking about here, it's point number 4, right? It's the value-based pricing. So Renato, what do you think in a second, whether it's science or art? Because I think if I go then on that component of that, let's say, reference case in here, I think it's also important to mention, hold on, I just put that out there. I went too fast, I'm sorry, but when you have a look on that differentiation value, right? So that difference, it's really the question, I mean, what is the basis for that, right? Do you have a breakthrough product? I think that's a cool question. Against what do you compare, right? I mean, is it a kind of generic market you're entering in, or is it maybe already a high cost, highly innovative kind of market, like, for example, rheumatoid arthritis was a couple of years ago. A lot of oncology areas, for example, might be now as well into that kind of area. I mean, it's a core question. Still, and that's then when we're going back again to the benefit assessment, which is then the kind of, I mean, we just had that letter D in there, the differentiation value. How do you measure it? That's also a bit the discussion we had, or let's say I maybe put in there as well a couple of minutes ago when I just said, what about progression-free survival? I mean, yes, I would say it's a major added benefit here, but if the endpoint is maybe not accepted by the payers, then you have an issue, right? The same, for example, with HbA1c in diabetes, or the measurements in blood pressure, all of those different kind of things. I mean, that might sometimes be kind of different in terms of the perception, what is really right, between industry, physicians, and healthcare payers, also not forgetting about the regulators, right? Because also they have a lot of times different perspectives.
Yeah, yeah. And Stefan, just starting from starting from the slide and talking about the example of Herceptin that you mentioned, that's actually a very good example, because the fact of the matter is that there is no, how can I say, no exact balance between art and science. It's a moving balance that may depend also on the level of innovation that we are talking about.
Okay.
Quite easily, especially when we talk about references and differentiation, if we talk about the very first targeted therapy for breast cancer based on basically measuring a certain gene or expression in the tumor, that Herceptin was the very first one. So what would have been the reference? In those days, there was no other targeted therapy in oncology. So in a way, Roche had to create a reference of its own. In a way, it could have gone, scientifically, it could have gone looking for pricing as a benchmark for pricing of taxanes or pricing of adriamycin and good old chemotherapy. That could have been a scientific approach. The piece of art was forget about chemotherapy, because chemotherapy is not targeted by definition. Exactly. So forget about chemotherapy, change the reference, and differentiate versus Taxol, and use Taxol as the low price benchmark rather than chemotherapy, and try to achieve the best possible premium over Taxol based on the demonstrated value for the product in the clinical trial. So that was, that's again, science and art. The balance in that case was, yeah, we need to apply scientific methods to set the price, but because the product is revolutionary, we need to create a new reference. We need to change the way we measure price sensitivity, even relative to the reference, because the product is too revolutionary to look at past price volume relationships.
I can fully agree. I think it's exactly that kind of question. Is the real breakthrough, right? Also objectively, with the same kind of discussion would you have, for example, in orphan drug areas, right? When there's nothing available, right? Or, yep. I mean, I can still remember the early days of rheumatoid arthritis, right? I mean, the prices of those available products were really somewhere, let's say, at the bottom, right? And then you're coming in with a real revolutionary kind of opportunity and possibility to treat those patients. So how do you want to price that? Yes, is it maybe 30% above or 50, 100% above that kind of current, let's say, prices, but those prices are really low. And that's, I think, not where and how you could really value the product. It's exactly the same story as with Herceptin. Fully agree. Very good point, Renato. Okay, perfect. But I think it was already a quite nice intro into your part, Renato. I think, again, just very briefly introducing you, just for those who do not know Renato so far. I mean, you're a health economist from background. You have a lot of experience, I think over 15 years of experience in the pharma industry, I think on both sides, right? So you have had the experience at the affiliate level, Roche, Italy. So really difficult as well environment in Italy, but also on the headquarters level, including being the director of global strategic pricing. And then since 2003, you have been in consultancies, founder, president of Value Vector, president of MME Europe. And now, I think after MME acquisition by Indigene, you're now a senior advisor to them at that level.
Yes, so yes.
Very welcome to Renato. And
thank you, Stefan.
For the remote control, because then you can as well go through your slides with a very nice kind of session there. Looking forward.
Yeah. Okay. So that's already my new. Sorry, need to go back one slide. Okay. Now doesn't let me go back. Anyway, pricing, art or science, and you see, I've already taken my new hat here. I'm now representing Indigene. which took control of medical marketing economics. That's what MME stands for, basically at the beginning of this year. So it's a very recent evolutionary change in the organization. And again, the art or the science, and the balance has actually to be found, I'd say, within each different organization, because every organization is different and the appropriate balance needs to be found. But let's go through a number, let's say through a few examples, and let's see whether we can together go ahead and see how the balance should be set. So if pricing is an art, why do we assume that price sensitivity can be measured? Typically with scientific methods. And we know that companies and researchers tend to measure price sensitivity. And they can do that in many different ways. Again, if it is an art, why do we rely on quantitative models to drive decision making? Why do we have return on investment models? And why do we use scientific methods to eventually set prices? And for the time being, I will not even go as far as arguing whether we have to discuss net prices or gross prices, ex-factory versus other price levels. On the other hand, if pricing is more science, how is that we can't really solve for the answer? We can't really build retroactively a model that explains how the price should have been to obtain a different volume in a given market. Or even more illuminating, how can we say whether a company was right or wrong in setting a price? I remember the debate, we have discussed this topic also at the eSport in multiple times, and oftentimes the debate was, did Pfizer price Lipitor rightly? Did they price it too low because of the value that Lipitor brought to the market and the revolution that it brought in the way cholesterol was being treated before and after Lipitor? And again, there is no answer to that. And the fact of the matter is that oftentimes when we use scientific methods to prepare our pricing strategies and set prices, we no longer, we not always have a good sensation, a good feeling, a good appreciation of the level of innovation that we are bringing to the market. In the case of Lipitor, that was clearly the case. Pfizer didn't really know exactly what the added value would be of Lipitor relative to other statins and other cholesterol-lowering agents. In our case, meaning Roche, in the Roche case, when Roche set the price for Herceptin, there was a lot more understanding of the revolutionary role of that drug in the landscape of breast cancer. And in a way, that was at the basis of also the revolutionary pricing approach that was used. And in the end of the day, there was a lot more art than science in the pricing decision that was made for Herceptin. So again, different lessons, different approaches in different companies. And again, it worked in both cases. It worked nicely for Lipitor, it worked nicely for Herceptin. Could have been better? Maybe. We can't really say. But the fact of the matter is that there is a mix between science and art. That's the name of the game. And the right balance should be found in this mix so that the decisions can be made properly in each company. And that's the other fact of the matter. all pharma companies, do they adopt identical pricing strategy and pricing policies? Do you have an answer? Try that. Evidently not. Companies are different and do not necessarily behave the same way. And even the same company may take different approaches in different phases of their life cycle. Think of a startup that is launching their first product ever in the market. Or think of the same company maybe 5, 6, 7 years later when they have to launch the second generation agent in the market. And you can see that decisions can be different within the same company. So science is definitely knowing that not all countries regulate pharma pricing in the same way. That is science. And you need to have crystal clear science to understand how you're going to select your comparators or your price benchmarks in each and every country. You need to know what price level you need to compare, even to start with. Develop pricing strategies without robust clinical data or without even knowing your value proposition. It's simply not happening. It will never be accepted. You need to scientifically look at the value proposition, clinical value proposition to begin with, and then pharmacoeconomic evidence built on that clinical value proposition. And this is, again, a lot of science behind it. Design your price corridors, accounting for international reference pricing rules. And I should also add, accounting for the different level of economic wealth and willingness and ability to invest money in healthcare in general and pharmaceuticals in particular. That's why you may not need just one global price corridor. You may need multiple price corridors because the world is not always the same. Stefan, you were introducing those conversations looking at US, EU, and maybe some other countries. Well, nowadays, China is an incredibly large market. You can think of China as actually multiple markets. Even the cash payer market, the richest part of China, is larger by population than most European countries. And the reimbursed market, the one that is driven by the national drug reimbursement list, which you can only access with massive discounting, that's really a huge market. And that's why there are companies that now focus a lot on China, because whether you look at the private market or you look at the national reimbursement drug list market, it's definitely a market worth pursuing. So there's a science. And going further, is negotiation an art or science? Well, here I have to go back to the art piece. But again, price negotiations are typically based on scientific arguments. So again, it's a mix. The ability of the negotiator is fundamental, because I can tell you that different people will achieve different results in a negotiation, but that negotiation will necessarily be based on scientific arguments. And then I must say, experience has taught us that, many people believe that creativity is the only limit. I think we need to be careful about being too creative, because again, experience can tell us that what in theory may work in practice may not work. And here again, I'd say it's true that art is important. It's true that creativity is important and that you may come with innovative pricing and reimbursement models. But before you go too far with the creativity, you should scientifically test whether certain approaches are applicable in reality. Think of Zyinteglo, for instance, a prominent case of a gene therapy. Years ago already, the company had started promoting their innovative pricing approach with payment in installments to allow, that would have allowed them to have a huge upfront price and to solve the budget impact issues that price was related with, by saying, oh, you're not going to pay us all at once, you're going to pay it in 5 years. What happened? Is anyone purchasing that product in Europe? Is anyone paying those installments in Europe? No, they had to withdraw the product from the market. Because again, being too creative without checking whether a certain solution can work scientifically is a mistake. So again, let's be careful finding the appropriate balance between art and science, because sometimes too much art, too much creativity may be dangerous. And that's the rule. The name of the game is rules and practical constraints may create unsurmountable hurdles to creativity. And that's again why you need to scientifically assess feasibility. So pharma pricing, there is a lot of science-based art. You need your artistic side if you want. You need to be creative, but let's make sure that we found all our decisions and recommendations on robust science.
Absolutely. I think that was greatly summarized, Renato. I think also good insights from the different kind of products. So let's, I think we're close to the questions part. So whenever you have any questions, but before maybe going to some of the questions of our audience, I think maybe also interesting, because you have just mentioned as well the negotiation part, and I think also, let's say, maybe some of the limitations maybe with one or the other, let's say, pricing, or let's say pricing policy probably at the end of the day, or solution potentially. I think you just brought up Zyinteglo as an example.
Yeah, that's an example. Let me give you, first of all, let me again establish one more terminological definition. Strategy is not necessarily the same as policy. So pricing strategy is
exactly
the key decision in pricing strategy is, are we going for parity, discounting, or premium versus whatever we use as a benchmark, versus whatever we use as the basis for our pricing approach. That's the strategy. How do we support that? That's again strategy. How do we support the value proposition? How do we help affiliates getting their product to the market? The core value dossier, that's all strategy. Policy is, how do we set goals? And when we set goals, as you were alluding to already, Stefan, we don't necessarily need to think about price goals only. Time to market access is another goal that legitimately should always enter into the equation, the famous trade-offs. Breadth of access is another element. And ultimately, if we really want to expand that even beyond the EU, US, China kind of conversation, if we really truly think globally about, especially for certain innovations and access, we expand the concept of access. I read a question also on ethics. There are ways of addressing that. There are ways of launching even innovative products and launching them quickly enough at dramatically reduced prices in regions of the world. Think about the so-called least developed countries, which obviously cannot afford paying the same price levels that the EU, European Union can afford paying, or Switzerland, or US, or even China can afford paying. So, and there are solutions for that. Typically, for instance, having multiple regional price corridor is one of those solutions. Having a generous licensing and local manufacturing strategy is another typical solution. The very same days when Gilead was being criticized because of the pricing of their hepatitis C drug in the United States, the $1,000 a pill kind of product, those very same days, they were giving away a license to an Egyptian manufacturer that would allow them to sell the very same pill at less than $60 per therapy, not per pill.
Exactly. And just to add maybe to that example, I think I know we take that as one example. What would have happened if Gilead would have, let's say, put out such a kind of therapy, not in hepatitis C, but maybe to solve the breast cancer issue, to heal patients from breast cancer? Would we have had the same discussions?
Well, as long as manufacturing costs allow extremely low, extremely low margins within certain geographies, probably yes. In the case of a biologic, obviously, cost of goods can be a barrier, even eliminating truly the cost of the license, the cost of the patent dedication. There are constraints.
Exactly.
I can make another example, again, going back to the Roche world, talking about HIV. You may recall this product called Fusion. Fusion was a fusion inhibitor, the very first fusion inhibitor ever developed and launched for treatment of HIV infection. And already in those days, we were wondering, how should we manage such a therapy in developed world and in the developing world? Yeah. And one of the issues was, you know what? The price is not going to be the barrier to market access for this product. There were other barriers. First of all, the product was only good for patients failing on therapy with protease inhibitors. So if we think of sub-Saharan Africa, what is the penetration of protease inhibitors in that market? Because you need to have failed on that first line of, or let's say second line of therapy before you can even think about prescribing Fusion. So that was the first hurdle. It was not the price of Fusion. It was the fact that penetration of protease inhibitors in that region was extremely low. And then another barrier, Fusion was an injectable. And the vial had to be refrigerated. And even the syringe, once you draw the liquid from the vial, had to be kept in a fridge. So before you think about solving the problems of sub-Saharan Africa with Fusion, you need to first solve the problem of electricity in Africa and the problem of making sure that every household in Africa has a fridge. Otherwise, Fusion may not be introduced in sub-Saharan Africa. Exactly. So we also need to be realistic about how do we solve the world's problems with pricing, because sometimes the answer is not pharmaceutical pricing. The answer is different in that. And once you have solved the issue of giving access to protease inhibitors to sub-Saharan Africa, and once you have solved the issue of having electricity in every household in Africa, then you may give away your patent and make sure that a South African manufacturer can produce Fusion at an acceptable cost for distribution in sub-Saharan Africa. But you need first to solve the other issues.
Exactly. I think that was a very good example. I think especially, let's say, taking a big health issue like HIV in Africa, but also then taking the whole environment as well into account. So I think it has different components, but I think ultimately, I think that's also why, let's say, countries and systems have those different, let's say, processes well in place in order to, let's say, negotiate in the price, right? I mean, if something is really unrealistically high or not, let's say, feasible to implement, then I mean, the product would most likely not make it even to the market, right? I mean, that kind of, let's say, part, and really that kind of feeling of, let's say, willingness, and obviously as well, not only willingness to pay, but I think also feasibility to pay. I mean, I can still remember we had as well once a product where I think it was a high premium product in Europe, and I think the value was accepted in as well. I think the example I remember was in South Africa, and we basically sat together with payers there, and I think ultimately we went as well a bit away from, let's say, the medical science, but just trying to find some patients where they would just say, look, we could pay for those, a bit more than a handful of patients, but we can at least pay for some of those, obviously also special price, but still, let's say, in a subgroup of patients. I think there are different, let's say, anchors what you can probably take on. I think maybe an interesting question as well was arising, Renato. I think somebody was asking how to factor in the life of patents and government interventions into pricing decisions. What is your opinion on that?
Well, again, the question is, there is a certain economic life cycle for a new product, which is obviously driven by patents and other forms of intellectual property protection. So again, if your time horizon is, let's say, 10 to 15 years, that's the time that as a manufacturer you have to recoup your investment and possibly generate extra profit that allows you to, again, fuel your R&D pipeline. And you have to have those concepts in mind when you set your pricing strategy and pricing policies. Now, profit is the result of, again, like revenues is the result of the price, time, volumes. So if your price is set too high and doesn't result into any volumes, you're not generating any profit. You're not repaying your investments. You are not going to have any reasonable return on your investment. So that's why you need to, again, be realistic and in considering your market conditions, and don't go for too high a price premium especially if after your initial negotiations you realize that the price is too high relative to the perceived value. You have to revise your pricing policy and revise your pricing goals, as simple as that. Because in the end of the day, what you want to achieve, whatever the perspective, whether you're looking at it from the perspective of a for-profit organization, you're looking at that from the perspective of the society, the worst case scenario, either way, from both perspectives, is the case where you have a price which is too high to be reimbursed and to result into reasonable access. You don't want a super premium that eventually results into treating no patients. That's simply wrong.
Yeah.
Whatever the perspective.
Exactly. And that's basically what I was also saying at my early kind of part of the speech, right? When I was more speaking about optimization of a price and not maximization. Because maximization would be basically the highest price possible, maybe for one patient, maybe for even no patient, right? You could have the best pricing, but if nobody's paying for it,
it's totally useless. It's totally useless.
Exactly.
You've been wasting your R&D investments and your perfect pricing research. You've been wasting all of that.
Yes, no, fully agree. I mean, maybe turning a bit the kind of whole discussion here. I think Frederick Arneberg was also adding a quite interesting one. I mean, we're discussing a lot about, let's say, price premium, but he's asking also, what about tenders? Where, let's say, the kind of part is obviously more going to the opposite direction, right?
Well, tenders, again, every country and every system has different regulations regulating tenders, to be honest. So again, you need the science to understand how tenders work in each and every country. And obviously, being in a tender with a generic is a completely different story than being in a tender with a unique product that no one can copy. So if you have a generic, obviously, it's a matter that the winner is the guy with the lowest price. And that means that if the guy is still a for-profit organization, they need to have a very robust and low-cost manufacturing and logistic organization. Otherwise, they may win the tender and kill the profitability of the company. So don't try to win a tender if that's going to kill your company, because in the end of the day, you will lose.
That's the point.
and even the customer is going to lose, because eventually, if you win a tender but have too low a price and you are not profitable, therefore at the end of the day, you won't be able to supply. So exactly. Even the customer is going to suffer, because they're going to remain without the drug.
Yeah, and we had such cases in Europe, right, in the last couple of years, where let's say we're only going, let's say, also in the kind of direction the winner takes it all, right? And that winner was basically offering a too low offer of a let's say solution, and they finally, let's say, could not really were not able, let's say, to provide the product because it was too low. Right?
You can supply at a loss. If you are a for-profit organization, you simply cannot supply at a loss.
Exactly. No, fully agree. I think we can maybe take probably the last question here. I think, which is probably linked to, I think, another question, which is all around, let's say, the perceived value or the differentiation value. And I think it's probably more as well, getting a bit the kind of feeling, what I read, at least out of those questions, is one, how to, let's say, measure it. And secondly, how to really, let's say, quantify, right? Which is a lot of time, not the most easy part, but I think there are measures and possibilities out there. Also science, right? I mean, how to measure those kind of values.
Because we are talking about a very special kind of goods here. So if we want to paraphrase the answer, we should always have evidence-based pricing. And when I say evidence-based pricing, I'm not just referring to price sensitivity analysis or health system analysis. I'm truly talking about clinical evidence, because we measure value based on the data that we generate and the benefits that results from the use of our new technology. So that's how we measure value. How do we make sure that that value is correctly perceived? That happens through proper communication of those results that can be achieved with the product. So publish it in the appropriate journals, make sure that the results of clinical trials go into peer-reviewed journals and not just on posters and abstracts, even if it is at major conferences. Make sure that it goes into scientific literature, peer-reviewed journals. Because oftentimes, when health technology assessors do systematic literature review, they may not find the abstract. They may not find the poster. They will only find publications in peer-reviewed journals. Exactly. And therefore, the value demonstration may go lost because of the wrong choice of publication.
Very good point, Renato. Perfect. I think that was a quite nice summary at the end as well. I think besides, let's say, only setting the price, I mean, let's say the basis needs to be right, which is obviously always the medical part. And I think a very important component, what you have as well just mentioned finally, is not only that you have it, but let's say the data needs firstly to be found, and the data needs as well to be rightly interpreted, meaning that you have the right kind of publications or documentation, and I think the right kind of interpretation as well. And that might as well drive the perception of the value. So thank you very much, Renato. I think that was a pleasure again. I think it was good fun. I think thank you also for the audience for the questions. I think very good question. I think we had a good discussion. Good and hopefully a fast recovery to our normal moderator looks. I think he will be back probably in March, and that brings me already to our next webinars. We have another very interesting one end of March, again the last Thursday of March, this time with Dr. Stefan Dr from Italy again, and Harald Herholz, a payer from Germany, and we're discussing about the clinical and the financial implications of 2 years of COVID-19. And then we're moving further. In April, we have Dr. Thalheimer, a clinical payer from Germany, discussing about the so-called NUP. So the NUP opportunity, so the entrance door into the added or let's say additional funding on top of the DRGs 6 months before the deadline. And in May, we have again back Ariane Schenk from the Bitkom Health and discussing about 2 years of digital health application to the DIGAs in Germany. So really interesting program. Watch it out on LinkedIn. And obviously, if you like the webinar, just rewatch it, share it. And obviously, we would like to welcome you as well again in March. Thank you all and have a good evening and talk and see you hopefully all soon. Thank you, Renato.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.